Hello, my name is Emma Skye, and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum. The Good Society Forum is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizamuddin of the Prince's Trust and a 2019 Yale World Fellow. Eid Mubarak, Niz.
Thank you so much, Emma. Eid Mubarak to those around the world who are celebrating Eid today. And very welcome to our webinar today. You are very, very welcome, as has become custom now for those who are joining. And I can see some folks who are already sharing with us where they're from, and we'll get to that in a second. You are part of the Good Society Forum community. We are a community of change makers, of thinkers, of practitioners who are interested in building a better society, especially one in a post-COVID world. So please do follow us on Twitter at Good Soc Forum, on LinkedIn, where we have a company page, Good Society Forum, on Facebook, where we have a Facebook group. And if you have any ideas about some of the challenges or issues that we should be tackling as a Good Society Forum, please do get in touch. You can email us on info@goodsocietyforum.com. All those channels will be shared with you via the chat function. So the plan today is we're going to hear from 4 speakers, and we will be taking your questions. If you have ideas, thoughts, comments, or questions, we encourage you to share throughout the webinar, so please don't be shy. And so we're keen for you to participate, and I can see already some wonderful people have already started sharing. Can you let us know where you are participating from? What city are you in? And we can already see some brilliant cities. We have Valentina, hey, welcome from Paris, France. Lance from Seattle, from the States. Naveen from London. We have Azim from Kyrgyzstan. Daji from Abidjan. Mulu from Washington, hi. Rana from Palestine, of the Eco Peace Middle East family, you're very welcome. Enoch from Adelaide, Australia. My God, we're covering every time zone, Emma. Pretty much. We have Thomas from Stockholm, Samir from Tunisia. We have Marissa from Kent in Washington, Anton from Tel Aviv, Israel, Jenny from Jerusalem. My goodness, I think we're once again covering pretty much every time zone in the world, and it goes to show the global impact of the forum in terms of our community, but also how much of an issue this is that people from all over the world are tuning in. We have Bill from between London and Bath, Brian from Durban in South Africa. I will not ruin things by doing my South African accent right now. Sophie from Denmark. Thank you so much. And George from Assam in India. My goodness, we can go on for a long time, but you are all very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today's topic, Emma, what are we talking about?
Well, climate change affects everyone, and it's a threat multiplier. And during the pandemic, our air has become less polluted due to the dramatic drop in carbon emissions from halted industrial output and declining energy demands. The sweeping policy responses to COVID-19 have revealed that governments could tackle climate change if they could muster the same focus and zeal that they've brought to bear on the coronavirus crisis. So how do we get politicians to treat climate change with the same sense of urgency and intensity as COVID-19? What is being done to prepare our countries for the effects of climate change? What more needs to be done to build up resilience? And today we're joined by environmentalists from China, South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Our first guest is Gideon Bromberg. Gideon is the Israeli co-founder of EcoPeace, which is a regional organization that brings together Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli environmentalists to promote sustainable development and advance peace efforts in the Middle East. He developed the cross-border community peace-building program, Good Water Neighbors, that is seen as a model for other programs in conflict areas. He's addressed the UN Security Council, Climate Summit, Munich Security Conference, the UN Commission for Sustainable Development, the US House of Representatives, the European Parliament. Gideon was named an environmental hero by Time magazine. and is a 2007 Yale World Fellow. Gideon.
Thank you so much, Emma and Nizam, for the opportunity to present this evening here from Tel Aviv, and to my many friends in the Muslim world, indeed, Eid Mubarak to you all. In the short 5 minutes before me, I'd like to bring home 3 points. One, to touch on the relationship between COVID, climate change, and conflict resolution, as the topic is labeled. Two, that COVID indeed, as Emma seemed to indicate, should help us expose populist politicians for being reckless towards national and global security concerns, and that the climate crisis, even more than COVID, requires increased cooperation and perhaps an opportunity for even broader conflict resolution. So for the first point, issues of common concern or common threats can lead to increased cooperation, and through cooperation to trust and to conflict resolution. Both COVID and climate change are examples of such common threats that don't stop at any particular border, but on the contrary, require cooperation to deal with them. In the Israeli and Palestinian context, we've indeed seen increased cooperation between health officials, be it for training of medical staff, provision of equipment, in data sharing, all towards the effort understood by both sides to decrease infection rates. The more the public come to understand that cooperation is a necessity and not a privilege, the public might hold accountable populist politicians that are belittling cooperation, that are supporting unilateral and national actions that are the very contrary to what is needed for cooperation to meet these common threats. At Equipeace, we've tried to highlight that unilateral annexation of the Jordan Valley, as proposed by this current Netanyahu government in Israel, in fact endangers Israeli public health, as it's contrary to the whole spirit of needing cooperation in order to fight the COVID virus, and that without cooperation, lives of both Palestinians and Israelis are at greater risk. The second message is that the COVID pandemic episode is indeed a wake-up call for the public to increase action on climate mitigation and adaptation needs to meet the crisis. COVID teaches us that those that ignore science do so at great risk to public health. The countries that were failing to invest in lockdown, in measures to reduce the pandemic because they belittled the science, have paid the greatest cost in public disease and loss of life. Similarly, if we're to meet the challenge of climate change and the mitigation measures outlined under the Paris Accord, then countries that continue to deny the science or are fearful that the public will punish them for measures that come with a high economic cost are in fact risking the viability of their countries and not only national security, but planetary security issues. COVID further teaches us that the public is indeed willing to pay high economic cost with complete close down if necessary when there's a clear and imminent loss of life at stake. And that is indeed the case with climate change. Finally, dealing with the climate crisis, even more than COVID, requires intense cooperation, not only at the global level of reducing emissions, but even more so at the regional level. When your neighbor fails because they don't have the adaptive capacity to provide basic services, water, for instance, for domestic and agricultural purposes, then the implications are not only on your neighbor's survival, but very quickly cross borders to impact the national security of your own country. And the case in point is the uprising in Syria, where climate change plays an important role in that uprising, and then in the instability that crosses borders in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, but also in Europe, where some 1 million refugees move to find shelter and better life. So that the need here for cooperation under the climate crisis is greater than ever, and it's indeed an opportunity to expose the populist policies of politicians that refuse to take science seriously and refuse to give credit to the public who are willing to pay the price when they come to understand that the implications very much impact not only their national aspirations, but the very survival of our planet. Thank you, Emma.
Gideon, thank you so much for that very compelling and articulate scene setter, especially the connectivity between COVID, climate change, and conflict resolution. Up next, we have Shuang Liu, a senior associate at the World Resources Institute, where she leads on China finance and the Belt and Road Initiative. Where the governments, private financial institutions, NGOs, and other partners, Shuang works to enhance the regulatory framework and provide enabling conditions to shift China's investment to sustainable finance. Prior to WRI, Shuang directed Low Carbon Economic Growth Program and Long-Term Strategies Task Force at Energy Foundation China. In this role, she oversaw the development and implementation of the foundation's strategies on climate mitigation and economic transition. Shuang also worked at Greenpeace East Asia, where she developed Greenpeace's first coal campaign strategy in China. Shuang, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks for the nice introduction, and great to be here to join the discussion with the peer panelists. I'm going to use the coming 5 minutes to share how the COVID crisis has an impact on China's infrastructure investment in BRI countries, and of course, the implication in climate change. I'm going to share the perspectives both on what we can do to promote and for the discussion inside China, and what kind of international collaborations that we should have. So first, we have noticed, and I think it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, that COVID crisis it's actually amplifying the trend that China's BRI investment has decreased recently, since it peaked around 2015 and 2016. A particular reason that the COVID crisis will make the expansion on BRI investment unlikely is the pre-existing debt problems only intensified with the crisis. It's estimated that about 20 to 25% of China's outward lending to BRI countries will be subject to renegotiation. And that scale of uncertainty and potential loss will not encourage Chinese lenders and the other investors to further expand their outbound investments substantially. However, we did see some political will of sustain the overseas investment in BRI countries. For instance, in February, Ministry of Commerce, that's the government agency in charge of foreign trade and investment policy, as well as the China Development Bank, that's China's largest policy bank, has jointly announced a statement on measures to support BRI investment, which include that China Development Bank will provide lower interest rate and will fast track all the BRI lendings and also provide more diversified financing tools to fulfill those projects in BRI countries. With that context, a silver lining that I want to point out and sharing is that Chinese investors are being more cautious of the debt sustainability and their investment in BRI countries. So with that intention, they are likely to turn their interest from the traditional massive coal projects into smaller projects with smaller financing requests when we're talking about energy infrastructure projects. And as we have noticed, that coal infrastructure investment used to account for a significant portion of China's energy investment in BRI countries. But if the Chinese investors are correctly factoring in the risks in BRI countries, they're likely to shift their investment and expand it in the renewable energy projects, including solar and wind projects. And also with the level of cautiousness from the Chinese investors, that gave us a chance to further flag the risks on their coal investment, including how likely the coal assets are going to be strengthened in BRI countries due to the more stringent environmental regulations, more ambitious climate targets and actions, as well as the possibility of less access to water resources in some dry areas. So that will give us a chance to further articulate those arguments with the Chinese policymakers as well as the stakeholders. So this is on the domestic domain. On the international domain, well, I want to echo Gideon's early point that we absolutely need international collaborative efforts. We noticed that China is increasingly becoming a large global financier, but it's not alone and it's not the largest financiers in many regions. Take example of Africa, and China is the third largest international creditor in Africa, accounts for 20%, while the multilateral financial institutions and private sectors still account for 35 and 32%. China is not going to take aggressive action on debt relief on its own. It will have to have the international collaborative willingness and actions in place. So this will be a chance for China and international players not only to share burden, but also share the practices and criteria in re-evaluating their financing and their projects in BRI countries. And with multilateral financial institutions engaged, that will give us more opportunity to integrate climate change discussion in the debt sustainability discussions. Last but not least, I think the international collaboration should also engage the stakeholder shareholders a lot. In the past, we have seen how the fossil fuel projects financed by China became reality in host countries because of both the pull factors from host country policymakers and stakeholders, as well as the push factors from the Chinese stakeholders. So in the next round of economic stimulus package discussion in host countries, if we can see how host countries are going to put more sustainable demands on the agenda, that's likely to have the, more response from the Chinese financiers that they always tend to fulfill and satisfy the demands coming from the host countries. So that will be another perspective on how the broader international collaboration under the COVID crisis can help us to make sure that we can stay on, well, we can be back on the track of climate change mitigation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shuang. Our third speaker is Rafi Alam, who's a Pakistani environment lawyer and activist. And he co-founded a firm that specializes in the energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. And he regularly advises government, international organizations, and corporate clients. He serves as a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council, the Punjab Environment Protection Council, and as advisor to Air Quality Asia. He's a passionate advocate for climate action, air quality improvement, and food sovereignty. And in September 2019, he helped organize climate strike marches in over 45 cities throughout Pakistan. Rafi.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Nizam. Greetings, everyone. It's a privilege to be part of this forum. Let me firstly set the Pakistani scene. We're currently at 54,840 reported cases of COVID, with 1,134 deaths. Our healthcare system is already stressed. There has been a failure to enforce a lockdown. The argument being put forward is that we need to protect the poor from starvation. There's a fear of spike in cases in the next 2 weeks on account of the lax lockdown. What's being exposed is poor governance. There's no leadership. Currently, there's a blame game going on in Pakistan. On the policy response front, we have certain forums that have been created, like a National Coordination Committee, but there's no reference in these policy responses to the constitutional and legal mechanism already in place. This exposes an element of panic, and on the whole, I feel that democracy, which I'll describe as the voice of the people, has been weakened. Let me secondly speak about where we are with the climate crisis. With the carbon concentration in the atmosphere measured at over 415 parts per million, more than in over 800,000 years when there was an extinction event, we face an existential crisis. Let me put this into context. The difference between global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, the difference between Paris and Kyoto, has been measured or estimated to be approximately 150 million deaths, mostly in cities in Africa and in Asia. Air pollution is already a serious public health issue in Pakistan. Meanwhile, we've already put enough greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to see an increase of at least 3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, or even sooner. This threatens, in the Pakistani context, the Himalayan Karakoram and Hindu Kush glaciers, as well as the Indus Delta, upon both of which Pakistan is existentially dependent. And I might add that currently our plan is to put a highway through this mountain area, the most sensitive of Earth's ecosystems, and to run a diesel truck through them in the name of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the One Belt, One Road initiative. This year in Pakistan, we are actually going through a wheat crisis, a food shortage, on account of a climate event that took place last April when there were unseasonal rains. And right now, today, there is a national emergency on account of a locust plague threatening parts of the Horn of Africa and South Asia that was caused by unseasonal moisture in the winter season for the last 3 years. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. So what can we do? Well, I have two suggestions. Firstly, the global debate needs to change. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is not fit for purpose. It isn't working. So why do we continue to insist on common but differentiated responsibilities, which let countries like China, Brazil, India, Pakistan, Australia, and so many more be able to argue, give them room to argue that they can continue to produce greenhouse gases in the name of economic development? Because I have a problem with the way economic development is currently ongoing. And secondly, I really passionately believe that democracy needs to be restructured better to allow the voice of the people to be able to respond to this capitalist, fossil fuel and consumerist and patriarchal society and economy that we currently live in. Emma?
Rafi, that was a very powerful call to action there, and I look forward to hearing more, and would like to encourage attendees to also keep sending in your questions. We are definitely receiving them, and we'll be putting to our panelists very soon. So up next, we have our final speaker. We have Janet Daltiel, recently of Greenpeace, where she led the international campaign to stop climate change, represented Greenpeace at intergovernmental negotiations, and led 3 expeditions to Antarctica. Janet now advises organizations working for environmental and social justice solutions. She lives in Holland, is originally from New Zealand, and is also a 2013 Yale World Fellow. Janet, over to you.
Thanks, and Eid Mubarak to everybody. Those are tough acts to follow, So thank you very much to the previous panelists for really interesting comments, remarks. So Emma, you introduced this as now we see what is possible when there's the political will and the visible urgency and collective recognition of a problem that needs what feels like quite extreme action. And I've been seeing that same piece of rhetoric quite often in recent weeks, and in some ways it feels like a piece of quite light rhetoric. And then last night when I was thinking about this panel today, I was realizing that it's actually very deep for me as well, because I can't tell you how many times in the last 25 years of working on climate issues that I've been patronizingly told to be more realistic about our asks for change. And so now we've just seen the range of what is possible and realistic to be much broader than we all thought when we're really faced by great crisis. And we can see the political question switches from what's possible to what will it take. So what is needed? I mean, we've already heard from other panelists some of the answers that are required. So the things that I would call out are two. One is that we still need massive changes in where the money is going. Fossil fuels and many other climate destroying practices are still hugely subsidized by governments and by investors. The other thing I wanted to introduce though to this discussion is that we still need to change the narratives about what's needed and what's possible. And the corona crisis has only reaffirmed to us how important narratives are in helping determine how a country has responded and is still responding. You think of the narratives from the populists versus the narratives from the more technocratic governments, for example. So the pandemic's giving us a window to make previously unthinkable progress on tackling the climate challenge in both of these dimensions, financial and narrative. And as governments spend, so firstly the financial part of it, as governments spend to stave off the worst effects of the pandemic, how they do that is going to be crucial. If we look ahead to the likelihood or the need for massive packages of stimulus spending over the coming months and possibly years, how those packages are designed will make a huge difference to how the new normal will look. So now, right now, these weeks and these months is the opportunity to design those packages in such a way that they're focused both on looking after the needs of citizens as directly as possible, but also on stimulating the economic activity that supports the new green and just normal. So for example, and I think everybody on this call will be able to list these as well as I can, policies that give advantage to renewable energy, for example, through carbon pricing. For example, green infrastructure projects like a network for charging electric vehicles. For example, not leaping to bail out airlines, and the list goes on and on and on. At a minimum, even if these packages don't go as far as actually picking winners, they must at all costs avoid the return of the old economic activities that no longer serve us. And this actually isn't even very radical anymore. Even The Economist magazine said so. So alongside how and to whom funding is channeled, just as, and maybe even more important, are the stories that go along with our emergence from this crisis into the new normal. So we know there's a lot of ill being done in the world with misinformation, and that's only getting worse at the moment. But the reason this is so concerning is because narrative is so immensely powerful in shaping our future. So the reason why fora like this one is so important is that they provide platforms for communication of meaning. So I just, as a very short list to finish off, I'd like to share some small stories that are giving me hope about climate in these weeks. So first of all is the rise of cycling. And I live in the Netherlands, so it kind of explains my interest in this. Many cities are now experimenting with closing off whole or part of streets to encourage cycling. Athens, Paris, London, Budapest, Bogota, Dublin, Milan, Berlin are just the short list that I found with a simple Google. And so this is being forced by the COVID crisis because public transport can no longer operate at pre-pandemic capacity. But it's clear to all that moving people into cars, even if they have them, isn't feasible. So hence the move to cycling. And that's made even more possible these days because of electric bike technology and the like. So to give you an idea of what that means, here in the Netherlands, the Prime Minister, who has announced opening up of secondary schools in June, has said that any pupil living within 5 kilometres or 5 miles of their school will not be allowed onto public transport and they have to bike. So it's going way further than just making it possible. It's actually really putting some teeth behind it. We heard last week in the Forum of Cities that, for example, Bristol is investing now in low carbon public transport also as a response to the COVID crisis. In April, Amsterdam announced that it's adopting the donut economy model for recovery from the COVID crisis. So if you don't know what that means, it's a circular economy idea, basically making sure that Amsterdam by 2050 will live entirely within the limits of sustainable resources for the city. So those are nice stories that show that not only some effort is being put into making some really practical changes, but also that the narrative is following as well. Just one point before I finish, and it's kind of responding to what some others have said, which is we have to avoid false dichotomies at all costs. This is not a competition between which is the worst disaster, COVID or climate. Just as it can't be either protecting lives or saving the economy, which is the dichotomy we've heard coming out of some governments. And so my last plea to you all is that whenever you hear those dichotomies being put up as being a reason why we can't act on COVID or on climate, avoid them and really call them out at all costs, because we have to get away from that kind of destroying narrative. Over. Back to you.
Janet, thank you so much. I'm now going to invite our other panelists to reappear so that we can go into the questions that have been coming through. So hopefully that should work. And we have Shuang and Gideon with us. Fantastic. Thank you again for all of your fantastic presentations. Incredible amounts of food for thought for all of us. I'm going to start off with a question in terms of, and I think it connects quite well to Janet, what you've just said, which is part of what we're trying to unpack here is COVID is enabling us to see that something is possible. Quick action is possible. Something that has been narrated to us to be impossible, as Janet has just said, is now possible. It would be really good to unpack what is it exactly in terms of challenges that are preventing people pre-COVID to understand why some of these things were not possible in your country context and in your areas of discipline. So maybe, Janet, we can just start with you, seeing as you've just answered very similarly, just to understand some of the challenges to why you need a COVID to even try and elucidate that this is a possibility. You mentioned disinformation, for example, as being one.
I don't know if you remember how your thought process responded to this COVID crisis through February and March and so on. But certainly for me, it's been this slow moving, it felt slow, it's been fast moving of adjusting of my own mental reality into, oh, it won't be that serious. Oh, it's going to happen to other people. Oh my goodness, it's going to happen. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to, oh, it will only last a couple of weeks. Oh, I can't go on for any longer than like 3 or 4 weeks. And I think there's something about the immediacy, the time frame that makes a difference here. And I haven't really thought through how you could make that parallel in climate, because as we know, one of the things about the climate crisis is it's much more slow moving. But I think there's something about our relationship to time that needs to change somehow.
Thank you. And Gideon, if I can ask you the same question, and in terms of the work that you do, maybe elaborate a bit more on the interconnected nature of some of these issues. So I think with COVID, what we've seen far more clearly, because it's so urgent, is the relationship between food supply. We've seen the relationship between key workers, the employment element, economy, the military, travel, to a disease that's obviously invisible. And we haven't quite been able to see the same thing with climate change. Is that the issue here, that it's now visibly available to us? You're on mute, Gideon. I'm just going to unmute you 1 second, please.
I think the strength of the unfortunate outbreak of the COVID infection is that those that have been denying science have been exposed. Have been exposed as politicians that are acting in a very reckless fashion. When you look at those that denied the science of COVID and said, well, it's not really a big deal. We can just overcome it. We don't need to bring lockdowns and to take urgent and immediate actions. Sadly, their countries have paid a terrible price. And I think that is the take-home message that the public now must bring home, to all politicians, that we're not going to put up with cheap politics, with politics that is willing to ignore best science, not of a minority, but of 99% of the scientific community. To the point of cooperation, climate change highlights the need, even more than COVID, for intensified cooperation, because the impact of climate change has nothing to do with a given political man-made border. It's much more focused on broader watersheds, on climatic movements of which parts of the world will become even more drier and water scarce, and which will suffer from greater floods and typhoons and the like. And therefore, I think one of the lessons that needs to be brought home in the way that the whole Paris Protocol has taken on climate change is that it's not good enough to have national reporting. And we really need regional reporting. We need all of the countries that are in the same climatic zone to be accountable to one another, to understand that the inability of one country to meet the needs and the adaptive capacity will impact their country, and therefore the neighborhood needs to reach out and help those countries that are less capable to meet the challenge of climate change, not only because of the commitment that they should have to a better world, but also for self-interest. Because what climate change further brings home is the failure of our neighbor will be our own failure. And that's a wake-up call that COVID has perhaps planted the seed, but climate change really brings home that message.
Gideon, thank you. And Shuang, if I can come to you, there's a comment here from Samia. Some 30 years ago, Algeria's UN representative demanded the right to pollute as a developing country, just as developed ones have done for decades. And I think you mentioned the discussion around risk appetite for financing internationally for China. Does it have to be so transactional in terms of the need to move to something as apocalyptic as climate change, in terms of understanding how to shift behaviors of a country? Or is a moral argument enough, as we're potentially seeing with COVID?
I don't think this is the argument we can only see with COVID. I think it's the chance that COVID create a more stress and pressure for us to push those arguments into the audience that we want them to resonate well with it. And I think at least part of our work, what we have noticed is that the environmental issues like in many other countries, it's actually not the prioritized issue on the agenda of many policymakers and stakeholders. However, when we're talking about risks of China's overseas coal investment, it's not only the environmental risks, it's also how we frame the environmental risks as financial, political, and even reputational risks to the Chinese stakeholders. So while you should think about the impacts caused by those BRI projects to local community and to host countries, but you should also really pay attention to the consequences to yourselves when you are not doing what you are doing, when you are not aligning your investment with the Paris target and the others. So to us, that's the strategy we kind of want to share on how we can mainstream, try to mainstream environmental discussions and to frame it as some other, to frame it with the other discussion framework.
Thank you, Shuang, and just to shout out to Dr. Etim from Nigeria, who agrees with the points that you've made, in particular with China's presence in Africa. Raphael, if I may come to you, there's a great point here from Michel Rentenaar, who was the former Dutch climate ambassador and COP21 negotiator for the Netherlands. And he makes the point, and I think this goes to your point about particular countries in the world. The general assessment is that US leadership, as well as the multilateral system, have been weakened by the COVID crisis, since combating climate change will require both an active US participation as well as a strong multilateral system. How does that bode for the fight against global warming?
I don't think it bodes well at all. And I think we have to become familiar with phrases like ecocide and begin to use them a little bit more frequently when people act and countries act irresponsibly like this. One thing COVID has taught us is that we put the global economy on hold because we wanted to save lives. And I think that's exactly the argument you take to the climate crisis. The numbers are staggering when you think of a degrees warming, 2 degrees warming, 4 degrees warming. And Janet, you mentioned we have to change the narrative about slow moving. Climate change is not slow moving. There were fires in Australia just 5 months ago, and then preceding that in Brazil and in the Arctic. And just last weekend, there was a hugely powerful storm in Bengal. And we have a locust plague here in Pakistan. So these need to be brought forward as powerful narratives about how millions of people are being affected on a daily basis by climate change, for which we need to save lives.
Thank you, Raphael. That's very powerful. And Gideon, if I can ask you the same question about the American role in particular and challenges to multilateralism at the moment.
So you know, the unilateral actions that I see in my own government here in Israel, American policies that withdraw from international treaties and cooperation, place us at greater threat. The sense of this is very, very hard to understand. I think it highlights not only to those that are Democratic voters in the United States, but perhaps the silent majority that have been swayed perhaps to some degree by a Trump administration, have now been exposed that there's no scientific basis behind the policies that call for disconnect, for lack of cooperation, for unilateral actions. And this is the time, hopefully with the next elections around the corner in the United States, that the public will respond accordingly and hold to account populist policies that are not based on science, but are based on perhaps science fiction.
Gideon, thank you so much. And Thomas certainly agrees with you in our comments. Janet, if I may come to you with a question from Ines. How can we put the climate crisis at the top of the agenda while the threat seems so remote to most people? COVID's consequences are immediate to everyone. However, not all countries are yet badly impacted, and even within countries, there are communities that are disproportionately impacted. So how do we put climate crisis at the top of the agenda, knowing that there's a disproportionality of personal impact? You're just on mute. Go for it.
That seems like the gazillion-dollar question, because I think that is a challenge, that COVID has done something in some ways very uniting to all of us. It's affected everybody in a way that climate has not yet, although absolutely, as Rafael says, we are now in a phase, and we have been for a few years now, but it gets worse month by month, year by year, where you are actually being able to point to things happening in parts in various countries and say, this is climate change and this is killing people. So if we're using the COVID model, then that's the way to do it, I think. It isn't necessarily yet affecting your next door neighbor, but it could be next. The other thing, I don't have any wonderful answers, because as I said, it's the $1 million question. The other way is to constantly look for ways to make it simpler and more directly relatable to people, because I hear it even in this panel, is that we tend to quite easily move into policy language. We're talking in terms of policies and big world events, and it needs to somehow be brought back down to the level of your next door neighbor that you can talk to about what's real for them, and which is why I find conversations about narrative and paying real attention to the assumptions that are underlying what people think is the way the world works, so that we can start chipping away at those assumptions.
Absolutely. And Shuang, if I may come to you with the same question around how do we take climate change to the top of the agenda, and just based on what Janet has said, in terms of your next door neighbor, of course, the democratic systems or the system of representation or voice will determine. How do you essentially answer that Inez's question of how do you take it to the top of the agenda, and then add the context of a system of Chinese representation and political systems? Easy question for you.
Oh, so easy. I actually want to make the analogy between the communication and the impacts under the COVID-19, and probably something we can borrow from if it hasn't any success on the COVID-19. So what we started, and what I have certainly noticed, is that for senior generation in China, they were actually in denial when the COVID-19 outbreak first happened. They were in denial of whether this is really happening and whether that's going to affect me. And also in terms of the actions, they were not willing to wear masks or taking actions, for instance, keep a social distancing from their beloved ones. And also it was actually around Chinese New Year when the outbreak happened. The tradition was for everyone to get together, and it was the biggest thing. And that's where the grandparents spend time with their grandchildren and all families getting together. So I think the communication at certain point worked well to convince, let's take the focus group of the senior citizens in China, that firstly, this is really happening. Even in some regions, which the cases of the confirmed patients is not really high, but the senior groups are willing to confirm this is really happening. So they are willing to support some measures in quarantine. And then second is that they recognize the importance of taking measures, for instance, social distancing and wear masks. So I think what we can probably learn from those is that firstly, I've noticed how some key experts who are very outspoken have been on the Chinese media and deliberately delivering message to senior groups who are vulnerable, and have the argument articulated so well, and that can fit into the mindset of the target group that we want to focus on. And then second is I've also seen kind of people are doing it jokingly on internet, well, not jokingly on internet, but for instance, there are certain style of the communication, pictures and messages that the senior group will have compared with the other age groups. So I've seen people using the same format and messages that the senior groups are familiar and comfortable with to send the message in a way that can resonate with them instead of the messages that we will feel better about ourselves. So I think to borrow the lessons from the COVID-19, that will be firstly, who will be the right messengers for us to use to justify that climate change is happening and it's really the mitigations we have to take now. And then second is there are groups where they're kind of out of our bubble. And we'll have to actually think out of our bubble and use the methods and the values that they want us to use to reach out to them. So I'll pause here.
Shuang, thank you so much, and could not agree more around an audience segmentation and the messenger. Gideon, if I may come to you with a similar question in terms of what Ines has asked, because I think it's a million-dollar question, which is how do you take this agenda to the top? Lance has said COVID-19 is concerning strictly humans, whereas climate change is impacting every species, plant, animal, bacteria, fungi on the planet. What can individuals do to help their politicians and communities fully understand and act on this in a serious and long-term venture?
So I think the challenge that we face is that COVID really brought a sense of urgency. People were truly fearful that they personally could be infected if they met someone who was carrying the virus. The reality of climate change and its impact on our health, on the health of biodiversity, on the health of the planet is a little bit more complicated, clearly. It's not touching a door handle that someone was infected and then being infected yourself. But the implications are actually greater because as the person who made the comment is that we're not just killing ourselves, we're killing all life, or we're creating tremendous havoc to the planet as a whole. And therefore, I think many of the comments about narrative and about message are absolutely critical. We need to be bringing forth the messages of individuals that are already experiencing what the implications of climate change means. So take residents in the capital of Jordan, Amman, who before the Syrian crisis and the last round of drought that really extended for 15 of the last 20 years, saw their water supply cut from 2 days a week, intermittent to begin with, to just 8 hours a week. These are peoples whose livelihoods are impacted. They feel and are fearful of the pressure of the implications of the climate crisis on their water supply every day. These voices need to be given resonance, need to be heard across the globe, not only from Amman, from Gaza, from Pakistan, from all over the world, so that as a global community, we come to understand that this is not something that might happen. It's something that is happening. People's lives, the nature and the environment as a whole has already been heavily impacted, and the consequences. And here COVID does highlight that when you adapt the precautionary principle, and even with some uncertainty, you take the measures needed to prevent the greatest risk, because that's what happened for those countries that really led the world in fighting, in protecting their peoples. They followed the precautionary principle. That's what needs to be followed here with climate change.
Good, and thank you for that. And passionate plea, and quite right too. There's a conscious of time, and so I want to pull together some comments and some questions. So Thomas has outlined initially the importance of the Paris Accords and the importance of of living up to the Paris Accords, and an underpinning question of how can countries be spurred into living up to the financing obligations of the Paris Accords. And then Minna has echoed the importance of stopping subsidizing fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are a key here. And then I think the question here is from, and I really hope I don't butcher this name, Mulu M. Mebet, who says, while the positive climate change as a result of the reduced use of fossil fuels is very welcome and encouraging, many argue whether investment in clean energy to replace fossil fuels will be fast enough to prevent economies from the impending recession or even a depression. And that's the kind of thing that worries people. So is there a realistic solution, in your opinions, to balancing the need to shift to a clear, cleaner, more viable alternative to the way we live in terms of energy and the current economic crisis that we are facing? So Rafi, if I may start with you on that question.
Sure. Well, you have to understand, we're here because of the climate crisis, not because of accident. We're here because of the system. We're here because of the capitalist system, a consumer system, a patriarchal system, as I said, and a fossil fuel system. And you can't use elements of this system to find this solution. I mean, you're talking about prices and taxes, for God's sake. This is not going to get us anywhere. We need to dismantle these systems very fundamentally. And this will not take individual action. I keep on saying that this requires collective action. This requires social action. It requires political action at a large scale. We need to redefine things. For instance, the nation state, which is the framework that we have. We have a global existential crisis, and what do we have as a framework? Well, let's divide the world into 200 different countries and make them opponents to one another. The nation state is not fit for purpose. We have to redefine these systems, and this will take collective effort. That's it. If you want to talk about individual efforts, stop eating meat and stop traveling.
Brilliant, thank you. Shuang, if I may ask you the same question, and then I'll come to Janet after that.
Sure. I think what I can share is probably when I started working on solar and wind power in China, there was a discussion of what will be the technical limits on how much renewable energy we can have in the grid. And so we've seen the discussion and the conclusion on the limit kept increasing for the past several decades. So it was probably 20%, 25%, and constantly we heard the stories of in some European countries, how they can run 100% on renewable energy for several days. So I think it's not, I think I want to echo Rafi's point. It's not really the technical constraints that we are working with, but also how willing we are to challenge the norm that we have been working with and push us to find the technology solution. And for instance, another promising solution we have seen is with the more renewable and the new EVs in China, and in the newest stimulus package plan, it was identified as economic priority to establish more charging stations, and what role the batteries in the EV can play in providing us more secured access and balance to renewable energy, is that we have to take one step back, not just look at what we are traditionally comfortable with, but look at a whole package and full solutions.
Shuang, thank you. And Janet, there's a question here from Corey, which is related to what we've just asked. In their own way, climate change and COVID seem to be great equalizers and thus create a sense of togetherness. But we've seen their effects are disproportionately felt by the poor, and they are only likely to increase inequality to such an extent that it might undermine this togetherness. How do we balance these narratives?
So first of all, I totally recognize that, I mean, I described the COVID crisis as in some ways a leveler because we're all experiencing, but of course we're not all experiencing it in the same way. And the day-to-day impact is far, far greater for many people than it is, for example, for me, who is just slightly inconvenienced by it. What I am hopeful though, and I come back to the same narratives, is we're not going to be able to change the inequalities and widening inequalities in the world overnight. But what I think this crisis has done, and which I hope we can take that over to climate discussions as well, is expose them. It's exposed the seamy, nasty underbelly of our current, the way we work in the world, the way the global economics and the global system works.
Janet,
and that gives
you.
us an opportunity to talk about it out loud and in the
Thank
open.
you so much. Very conscious of time, Gideon. I'm gonna come to you, but I want to go around. I want you to have the last word. So just keep those questions that we've just said in mind. And I want to quickly go to Janet, Rafe, and Shuang and ask you a question that Janet has already answered, which is one thing that you have seen that is giving you hope for this agenda currently. Just one. I know you've mentioned a few.
I will pass on because I did already mention it.
Thank you. So Rafe, over to you.
I think that the cycling has been fantastic. So many people in a city like Lahore have moved to cycling, and it's just, you know, the mindset is there. The infrastructure needs to replace it.
Fantastic.
To be replaced.
Yeah, as a frequent traveler on airlines, what gives me hope is that we actually do not need that much travel as we can see during the COVID crisis. And I think many of us are willing to take alternatives and seriously think of what we can do differently.
Thank you. Gideon, you have a few minutes just to answer that last question around balancing, addressing issues of climate change and the economic recession and downturn that we're in, and then what gives you hope?
So I think the challenge to meet that question is the need to cooperate. If we can cooperate as a global society, then we can overcome these challenges. You know, at Ecopeace, we're working on a program of, on the one hand, producing renewable energy in the hinterland of the deserts of Jordan, that produce electricity so that on the coastal plains of Israel and Palestine, you can desalinate water using renewable energy and provide energy security and water security for all. It's not a technological solution. It is a cooperative solution. It's to overcome, as Rafe had said earlier, the nationalistic approaches that everyone's on their own. No, if everyone's on their own, the boat sinks. If we work together, if we cooperate, we can all sail forward. So I think that's the message as to how to overcome both COVID and climate, is to increase cooperation. And then finally, for me, what's really touched my heart is the kindness and generosity that I've seen in this crisis. That people have slowed down and are worried about, you know, their grandparents, and are willing to not see their grandparents, you know, to make sure that they're fine. That level of care and concern, if we can keep that after you know, this wave of the pandemic dies down, if this can become the new normal, taking care, considering for the welfare of the other, then that gives me hope.
Gideon, incredible remarks to end with, that emboldened empathy that we all have. Gideon, Shuang, Rafe, Janet, thank you for your time, your rich context, and apologies to attendees whose questions we have not been able to answer. That was an incredibly rich conversation. Thank you so much. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much to the panelists and for the audience and for all those great questions. And please join us again at the same time on Wednesday, when we're going to be discussing the future of food.
Bye-bye.
Bye.